Good evening and welcome to 365 Days of Amazing Stories with Theo Mayer. Here we are on day 161. It's a multiple of 7, believe it or not. And what is that? Week 23. And I'm going to be telling stories from my own life. My life as a steward. Now, the topic I wanted to talk about tonight was change and embracing change. It's cold tonight. Can't believe it, but here we are in the middle of June. It's June 11th. And I've got a fire going to stay warm. Very unusual. Usually it's much warmer by now. Change is just something that we are dealing with all the time because it never ends. Things are always changing. Everything around us seems to be changing. We change all the time. Our thoughts are constantly in flux. Our moods are in flux. Our bodies ever changing. Yet somewhere inside, hopefully there's a place that doesn't change. And how often I find myself when things are going really, really well, wishing that I could just freeze time and just stay in that beautiful feeling of everything's going just the way I want it to. But of course, that only lasts so long, and then you're on or into something else, and maybe it's not quite the way you want it to be. In 2016, up here on the mountain, 2016, almost 7 years ago. Almost 7 years ago, 5 weeks more, and we'd be 7 years ago. Bronny's fire started. It was in July, and 85% of my property ended up getting burned. Now, I stayed on my property, and that's quite a story in and of itself. And I'm actually working on getting a book published that's all about that story. I spent all night stopping that fire from advancing up our ridge. I saved my place, and not that I was trying to, but I probably saved everybody's place that was beyond the ridge behind me or higher up. Because I stopped the fire. It took me all night. I was the only one on our ridge that stayed and stopped the fire. And it was quite an experience. I had a fever during that time. The day the fire started, I had a 102-degree fever. It didn't go away for 10 days. I had that fever all through the Bronny's fire. And I know it got higher at certain points. And there were times that was lower, but I had it the whole time. So that night I was stopping the fire, I was not feeling my absolute best. I was definitely in quite an altered state. And it was pretty cool in a way, because when I went down to work on stopping it, I felt like I was greeting a friend, and that I was going to work with the fire instead of fight it. Now, I had been on Midcoast Fire Brigade at that point for 6 years. I'd been on some pretty major fires, so I wasn't afraid of fire. But I was afraid a little bit, because as that fire was approaching, it was very chaotic, and there was a lot of fuel for it to work with. So the flames were huge in places. When I went down to deal with it on my property, I dealt with it where it was small. And if it was big, I let it go, because I knew in a little bit it would get small, probably, as it worked its way up and down the hillsides. burning. On the way up, pretty big. Then, as it was trying to get momentum up again, it would burn down or sideways, and that's when the flames would be quite small, and that's when I would go and work on it. And so all through the night I worked and eventually got it out. I was up all the next day dealing with things, which is a story in and of itself. Finally, I went to sleep, and I had a dream that night of Agni, the fire god, came to me and said, "This is what I do. This is my job. In order to make way for the new, I have to get rid of the old." Now that is change. You got to change things up to make way for the new. It's always this way. You got to get rid of the old in order to make way for the new. And the change is constant. It is always happening. Got to get used to it. Got to accept it. Now, Agni turned to me as well and he said, "Don't worry, but I'm not done." I'd put the fire out by then. Cal Fire was up here camped on my property with their engines plugged into my hydrants for water. So I was feeling pretty good about things at that point when I finally went to sleep. Anyway, 3 days later, Wednesday night, the fire came. It wrapped all the way around our ridge and came up from kind of the south and was big. It burned a house below me, sending huge flames up into the sky. And, you know, those words of Agni came back to me. "Don't worry, but I'm not done." And so it did. At that point, it caught some leaves that were in a gutter on fire of a barn that I had. And fortunately, my son was here. He saw it. It was 4 a.m. We run down and pulled those leaves out of the gutter and put the thing out pretty quickly. And we stayed up until 6:30 in the morning. I think we finally went to sleep in a fire shelter that I have that doubled as a cold room. I had scuba tanks in there. I cracked one of them open so that some air would come into the room because it was so incredibly smoky outside. And as the air was decompressing out of the tank, the outside of the tank got ice on it. So not only were we breathing beautifully fresh air, but we also were getting cooled down by the effect of the tank decompressing, so to speak, the air coming out of the tank. And even though we didn't sleep long, it was a very nice sleep. And I ended up having another dream that night, which was of Mother Divine herself. Now, she had beautiful, long, dark hair, and it was getting kind of tumbled. In fact, that's the only part of her I saw was her hair. And her hair was getting tumbled into the earth. And it disturbed me that, you know, her hair was getting dirty. So I asked her if she could stop. And she turned toward me and she stopped and she said, "I'm going to stop for you now, for a moment. But you have to realize," she said, "change is what keeps this all beautiful." Wow. What a thing to live with when 85% of my property got burned. And to me, the most beautiful part of my property was this incredible madrone forest that was, you know, filled with trees that were 50, 60, 70 years old. It was like a tree church, a tree cathedral. There was nothing growing really underneath it. So these tall trunks were shooting up into the air, and then there was a high canopy of leaves. And beneath it, everything was sort of open. I took that forest for granted, not realizing that I was going to lose it. But it made me cry to lose that. And it truly was like being in a cathedral. sacred place. Now, I'm still getting used to the change. We've spent the last, I don't know how many years, 5 years, clearing ceanothus, burning it during the winter time, trying to make way for the new madrones to come back. They're sprouting up from their roots. And it's quite a thing to see the changes as they continue to take place. Now, again, if you're going to be a steward, you're going to have to accept change and embrace it. Some change we try to initiate. For instance, I like fruit. When I first bought this property, I bought a lot of trees and I planted them. Every year after that, I kept planting fruit trees or nut trees. So I have pomegranates, almonds, citrus of lemons, grapefruit, oranges, mandarins, limes. I think I mentioned pomegranates, figs. I have apricots and peaches and pluots and plums, apples, number of different varieties, pears and olives. And you want to see these things grow up to the point where they can really give you food. And so you try to initiate change with them by providing good nourishment, feeding them with manure and compost and lime and azomite, all these different things that can really nourish the tree to grow more quickly. Also, water to get them established. The amazing thing is that most trees, once they're established, even in hot, dry places, like where I live in the summertime, they seem fine. They seem quite able to make it through a year without getting any additional water during those hot, dry days of the summer. It's great to see the change taking place in the plants that we plant from seeds. Squash plants, bean plants, lettuce, parsley, basil, tomatoes, and day by day to go out there and actually see the change that's taking place. What a thing. One of my favorite things to do is first thing in the morning, after I've gotten a little hot water and ready to walk around and limber up a little bit, to take a walk through the orchard and the garden and see what has changed. Now, sometimes your children can beat you to it. And you're like thinking, I'm going to go out there and pick those apricots because I know they're going to be ready in the morning. And you get out there and some little person has beat you to it. That's the change we have to embrace too. We have to be ready to let go of the things that we were hoping for, that because of circumstances might change in a moment. Fires like that, it forces you to accept change, and the change can be quite dramatic. But there's all kinds of other teachers that teach us that lesson over and over again. I don't know, but every vehicle I've ever driven or owned, every piece of machinery I've ever had, at some point in time, some part of it fails or breaks. One moment it's working, and the next it isn't. Now, I learned to cuss when I worked out in Montana, when things would break. Now I've gotten to the point where I just kind of go, okay, gonna have to fix that one. And on you go. One thing to the next. Take it all in stride. Go with the flow. Accept the change and surrender to it. Okay, that's how you steward one day to the next. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining.